I'm just finishing packing up my bike, ready to head down to Littlehampton, and I'm meeting a lady called Bekah Legg. She runs a charity that supports women that have experienced violence in the church, in marriage, and more widely. And they're a really significant charity in that space. The reason I'm speaking with her, and I can't remember how I first found her or thought of her, but the reason I wanted to speak with her is through my experience of making these videos, and please check out the other ones, I've learned that victims and those of us in the community that have been abused are often ostracised. And even then I was quite reticent to say us, but we are us, right? Brothers and sisters, that makes us. The body of Christ, that makes us. And yet when people are abused, they're ostracised, they're pushed out the camp, they're silenced, they're ignored. Maybe a report's written, but it will take years. People that speak up are marginalised, they're called mavericks. That's what a friend of mine called me on Sunday. And I want to meet Bekah. Maybe she's what others would call a maverick. Maybe she's doing something that's far more godly than a lot of other people. But I want to understand her story, who she is. And it's 30-something degrees, which is a bit hot. But I've been stung twice by bees yesterday, and I've got a swollen toe, and I've got one on my neck. But yeah, I just want to go down and meet her and spend time with her and see what's going to come about. So I'm really fascinated about the work that she does, the people that she supports and speaks on behalf of, and hopefully it's going to inspire you. Bekah, thanks for having me to your home. We're going to talk about you, what you do, and maybe some stories as well. You seem to be, from my perspective, living out you seem to be responding to what God's prepared you for, and you're just from really a distance reading about you, but that can isolate you a little bit, I think, and I think a lot of people need encouraging to speak up and speak the truth as well, rather than just opting out. What is it that what's your life about in respect to saying to others, you are a good fit in God's kingdom? And how does your life kind of reflect that stuff? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I think so. I'm trying, like my brain is now going over in terms of where to begin answering it. But I think certainly the work that I do is like, it's helping women who have been pushed out of like intimate relationship, marriages, but sometimes have been pushed out of church, to say like, of course there's a place for you in God's kingdom. Doesn't matter that other people think you're a bit awkward or your story's inconvenient, or that actually you're dealing with trauma and that leaves you a bit prickly around the edges or a bit difficult, you've got challenges that other people don't understand. Like, God sees you, God gets you, God made you. The reason you're responding the way that you are is because of how, like, the coping mechanisms that God created you with. So, that's an important part of who I am. And like tracking back through my story, I trained as a teacher originally. And, when you're a teacher, your job is to pull out the best in every child that you work with. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are way trickier to work with than others. And because they don't fit what we call a normative mode. But like, they've still got gifts and talents. I was hearing about a book recently, don't quote me. Well, you're filming me. But like, I think it was called Tribe, but that could be wrong. It's something like that. And it's talking about neurodiversity and all the stuff. And it was talking about the fact that actually, if you were to go back in time, then the reality is, like, all the kids nowadays who have ADHD, they and their families would probably have been the hunters in the tribes all those years back, because they were adapted, and all their skills that they've got would have had this great purpose, and they would have been really respected for their quick thinking in a crisis, for their ability to just react and go and keep on going, and then probably have time to crash afterwards, because that's also necessary. But that would have been part of who they were. And we live in this world which has gone, well, this is how everything has to be, and a church which goes, this is what normative looks like. And we've lost space for people who've been through stuff, people who are struggling with things. We've lost space for, people who don't fit the mould. I was in a church where I heard one of the leaders moaning that there was a lack of people to have leadership positions because we weren't a university town. And my brain just exploded with, why have they got to have gone to university? Like, Jesus chose people who are fishermen and, you know, just not university types. They did not have a degree.
Tax collectors, yeah.
They were, you know, Jesus he saw leadership potential in everybody because leadership potential isn't academia. And so I feel like I've gone on a really long answer to this, but the truth is there is a space for everybody, so long as we want our church to reflect the breadth of humankind. But that's you know, challenging for some people because it's neater and tidier if we want everyone to look middle class and, you know, together.
And I guess that's where I've kind of got to as I visit the old church and sort of make friends and things. I sort of think it's still very similar. A lot of the places, especially those that I was kind of connected with when I was working in churches, I sort of thought, it's been 20 years, and it's kind of the same.
Yeah.
And why? What's so maybe? How do we talk about maybe the things that need to change, and then the kind of glimmers of light?
Yeah.
You know. So maybe tell me a little bit about you, and you know where your story. Like, how did you? What's your relationship with God like? Where did it start? With
okay.
Maybe that's a good way to
That's
start.
cool. Well, I'm that classical brought up in a Christian family girl who actually brought up in quite the conservative end of the church as well, like the Brethren church, but actually a church which I really loved and who really loved me, and who, as I look back, there were some restrictions around my life that I didn't even realise were there, but that I've managed to break out of regardless, and still love the people I grew up with and all the rest of it. And but actually, that meant that I didn't quite fit the mould even as a youngster, because I've got this real memory. I don't know if this is relevant or not really, but it's real memory of probably in sixth form age, our church did youth services. And of course the boys could do the preaching and I could read a Bible passage. And I used to sit there so frustrated at this. Oh, if I'd have said it like this and I'd do that but it wasn't my space or my place. And at the time I didn't really question it. But there's Bekah, you're in a bit of an awkward fit, because as a girl, you're meant to look like this. And actually you are showing some different giftings and interests and things that you are good at. And well, that doesn't really quite fit the role. So you just need to tuck into this box over here, which I did find awkward, but it was never in a nasty way. It was just in I don't know, I'm probably making excuses for stuff here, but people really loved me and wanted the best for me. But the worldview everyone had was that this just wasn't possible. Yeah. Anyway, went away to university and did a whole bunch of things really. Went away to university, ended up going to teach in a school in Kenya, which was not on my list. I was looking for jobs in Bristol, as you do. Ended up, saw this wonderful advertisement for a school in the Highlands of Kenya, and I thought, oh, that looks interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And
up the Great Rift Valley.
Up the Great Rift Valley, yeah. It's a little school called St Andrews. Well, it's not so little, but in Turi.
I've been to Neruru. Is it near there?
Oh yeah, it's near there.
Yeah.
Yeah, not so far, probably about an hour away or so. But
cool.
It's a really, really beautiful spot. It's a really beautiful place. And I taught for 2 years, and whilst I was there, I met a man who wooed me and charmed me, and I married him. And I was out there for another 3 years in that marriage. But the truth is that marriage, very quickly, it became apparent that the marriage wasn't difficult. My husband was very difficult and very abusive is the language I now have for it. But I didn't have the language for it back then. I just knew that I was very unhappy, that I was increasingly frightened, and that I didn't know how I could survive this situation that I was in. And you know, I was neglected, I was abused, there was a whole heap of things, and within that had 2 babies in a very short space of time as well. And it was a really tough situation that I ended up, again, long story short, I can tell it longer if you want, I ended up flying home with my 2 little girls 23 years ago, and kind of landing back in the UK, not knowing which way was up, not really being sure of who I was anymore, very confused, very devastated. But very relieved that I felt in a much safer space. And I moved back in with my family for almost a year, actually, because my youngest daughter was quite poorly and I needed a bit of help. But it was so fascinating going back to my local church and them trying to work out what to do with me, because I really didn't fit the mould now, because now I was getting divorced and now I was a single mum. And what do you do with that? And in fairness, they were amazing. You know, they were amazing at practically. So I ended up moving into the house next door to my parents. It had been my grandparents. My mum had been letting it out. And in a lovely God story, the day I made the decision to finally come home and get safe, her tenants had handed in their notice. So I spent the first part of that year redecorating, like degranifying the bungalow and, you know, sanding floors and building flat pack furniture. And the guys from church were amazing, came out, helped me with everything. This one lady was really kind, and out of her housekeeping money every month, she bought me a present. So for a year I got a present, a little set of mixing bowls, salt and pepper shaker, things to make my house a home. And it was incredible. But there was this one conversation with one of the elders of the church who had been so generous with his time, so generous with his talents, you know, like sanding floors, painting, stripping wallpaper, all the stuff. And he'd been, we talked, you know, we talked as we were decorating and DIYing and all the other things. And he'd been telling me about the youth work, and they were really struggling. They really needed somebody to come on team. And I just said, look, I know I'm not in the right space at the moment. I need to get my head together and get a bit stronger. But when I'm ready, I'd love to come back and help. And I could just see his face register, panic. And he said, gosh, I don't know. What would people say? Right. And it was the funniest conversation in the context of this man who clearly loved me and my girls. And I was so supported practically, but my existence really challenged how does this fit into church though? I don't know. And I was how old would I have been then? 27? So I was really young still. And, you know, I did not want my life to be written off because I'd made this Mahusive, you know, mistake of a marriage, or because my husband had made done these terrible things to me, truthfully. You know, I would have a word with myself about my decision making, but at the end of the day, it was my husband who was the reason I had to leave. And that church went on a journey, and they were brilliant with me in the long term. But it was so fascinating, this initial, you used to fit, but now you don't fit. And I don't know how we get our heads around this. And credit to them, they did get their heads around it. Like, they really did. I did the youth work. They ended up with me. I was the first woman they got to lead services. I was the first woman they got to lead communion. Like, there was this whole journey of, I did once say, I feel like you're sacrificial lamb. I feel like you're pushing me out there to be the first one. So if people throw rocks, it'll be me who they land on. But I didn't fit. But actually, those guys got their heads around it. But it was because they already knew me, I think, as well. So they wanted to make it work. And I think it's harder when we don't want to make it, when we don't know somebody enough to push through to the other side. I think that sometimes is a bit of a challenge. So yeah, that's part of my story of getting there. And now I've forgotten the rest of the question.
So the question I would ask, and maybe this is one you say, Matt, we don't want to talk about that, but how on your own were you in Kenya? How did, because that's an enormous move to leave a home, a family, a marriage with two girls, to get on a plane alone and then just to fly home. What happened in that process? Was that where was it people that were supportive? Was it God speaking with you? Was it sort of how does that happen?
I was insanely alone, actually. Because trying not to make it too long of a story, but essentially I'd had my babies in England, so I flew home to give birth, helps with passports and a whole heap of things. And when I'd flown back to have Meg, who's my youngest, we'd moved house. So my husband had moved house whilst I was gone. I knew that was happening. I didn't know where we were moving to. I had asked that we'd stay above a certain altitude because of malaria and a whole bunch of things. So I came back to a new area where I knew nobody, to a house that I didn't know with my two little girls. And my mum had come back out with me initially to help me on the plane, just with two babies on a plane, because that's horrendous on a night flight, and to help me settle into the new house. But she had to go home at some point. But even before that, I had become increasingly isolated. And again, nowadays, I've got the language for that. That's what happens in domestic abuse. So often, the abusive partner actually systematically disconnects you from those sources of strength. sources of a different voice, challenging perhaps behaviour and things that are going on. But definitely that's what had happened. There had just been increasing people that I wasn't allowed to meet up with. And I was never told I wasn't allowed to meet up with them. It just was made really clear that there was massive disapproval of those people, or they were a bad influence on me, or I became a different person when I was with them, and I, not a nice person, and that. So, and so I just slowly but surely learned, well, if I see that person, well, that's not okay. And if I hang out with that person, well, they're a bad influence, and I'll hear about it for the next week. And so you just slowly but surely get disconnected. And of course, my family lived on the other side of the world. The people I'd grown up with were on the other side of the world. I wasn't connected into church at that point because we were quite remote. And my husband didn't think it was okay to go to local churches. It would have been culturally complicated anyway, being white people and them being black churches, and it would have been a weird fit. I would have probably made everything really awkward if I'd have shown up. They wouldn't know what to do with me. But I was very alone, and it became really apparent when I went back out to Kenya that last time with my girls and my mum that nothing had changed. In fact, everything had got an awful lot worse. And actually, my mum saw the stuff for the first time and was quite horrified, and in a weird, probably people-pleasing eldest daughter way. I just thought, oh, now mum gets it. Maybe I can think about a different option. But also, I'd been raised in a church, where marriage is for life. This is what you do. If you've made your bed, in fact, that phrase just kept going through my head. You've made your bed, and now you need to lie in it. You've made your bed. And truthfully, no one had ever told me that, but it's what I'd kind of absorbed from culture. And so I just thought, well, I am going to have to deal with this somehow. And I was coming up with plans for, maybe I could get it so that my girls go to school in England in the state system in term time, so we can live in England, and maybe then I could tolerate the holidays back out in Kenya. Or maybe I'll get them to go to day school in Nairobi so that we live in Nairobi and I just go out to the farm at weekends. Maybe I could cope then. Maybe that would be manageable. And I was coming up with all these plans, but there was a real God moment. It was 100% a God thing that meant that I knew it was okay to leave and it was okay to come home. And it was such a simple little thing. When I'd been in England giving birth, not during the birth, but a little bit later on, I'd ended up watching Songs of Praise, which is not a normal practice, but I had. And there was this children's choir. It wasn't a children's choir. It was a choir competition, and a children's choir sang a Matt Redman song, who I'd never heard of. I'd been living in Kenya, and I'm kind of like out of stuff anyway. And this song was called The Father's Heart, and it talked about God singing his love songs over you. And it was just a really beautiful song. And I commented to my sister-in-law who was there and said, this is a beautiful song. Anyway, didn't think anything else of it. Got back to Kenya, and this parcel arrived in the post for me of Matt Redman and his CD, and just a little note saying, knew you liked his song, thought you might like to hear the rest. And this is how long ago this is. I got out the CD cover and I looked at the lyrics, and I saw this reference to verses in Zephaniah. And fundamentally, it's this bit about God singing his love songs over you. But if you read back, it says, sing, O daughter Zion, for the Lord has seen your distress. And it goes on and says he's mighty to save. And you need lie in fear no longer. And I just knew that was God saying, I see, and you don't have to do this anymore. I just knew that I knew that was God. And, so from that moment on, I spoke to my mum, who was still there, and I said, I think I need to do this. We spoke to the British High Commission to see if they could support me getting home. They said that they couldn't because my husband was too influential, and that they realistically would have very little power. So I just needed to disappear. I didn't disappear. I felt very strongly again that God said to allow my husband to say goodbye, and he actually drove us to the airport, and we got on the plane and left. And all of that was like with my heart in my mouth, waiting to be arrested or stopped or taken. But none of that happened. We did get home, and there are these really beautiful moments in the story where I just know that God provided me with people, because I flew home with 2 little girls on my own, frightened. Just far too many bags to carry for one person. But I made it, and God was really kind and really showed me that this was what, not just okay, it's what he was calling me to. And he provided people in the airport, people who just supported me, helped me when my daughter threw up all over the floor, on the plane when it was difficult at night. It was just an extraordinary journey. And I landed home, and my parents were waiting at the end of that, Heathrow arrivals channel bit that you go through. So yeah, long time ago. I don't often talk about it anymore, but it was this redefining moment when I had to be insanely brave and do things that felt horribly dangerous. But I look back and just know that God was with me the whole way through that. And that has defined my life ever since. When I face challenges and tough stuff, I just know that God doesn't always make everything easy for us, but he does go through the waters with us.
So you're in Bristol. Mm-hmm. You're in your grandma's house.
Yeah.
You're getting rid of that grandma smell and grandma colours.
Yeah.
And making it your home for your family. What was this? And you were, rather than just reading the Bible, you were preaching. Mm-hmm. What then happened?
Oh, well, at that point, I went back into teaching, because teaching's one of those jobs you can just roll back into.
What do you teach?
So I'm trained as a history and maths teacher, which is the weirdest combination in the
really
world.
Weird.
And maths means I'll always get a job. History is what I really love. But I went back doing supply teaching initially, because again, you can just pick and choose what works with two little girls.
Yep.
And I did that, but I ended up working for some friends of mine who started like a .com fair investment company. And I went in as an office manager. They called me and said, Bekah, we need an office manager. And I had to Google, what does an office manager even do? And I thought, I've got transferable skills.
Well, maths.
Maths.
And yeah, okay.
Yeah, like organising people, setting them targets. I can do that.
Yeah.
So I did that, and I ended up having these 3 wonderful years working for this organisation, and kind of was there as it grew from 6 people to 30 people, but along the way, ended up working. It was a Christian organisation, and they tithed, gave away so much of their profits, and part of my role was managing that relationship with charity partners. And part of that, I ended up working with this brilliant bloke called Richard Pendlebury, who they brought in as a fundraising consultant for one of the charities. And he just said, well, I'll do the work for you, but only if you let me have this woman to be my assistant. And he just took me under his wing, him and his wife and my girls. Like, they just took us under their wing, and he mentored me in a way that was, I now recognise as, I knew it at the time, was just extraordinary. Just decided to invest in me as a person, like totally get me to do stuff and be helpful, but he really invested in me and drew out a lot of the stuff that he saw in me. And he helped me remember who I was, and just gave me opportunities to do things that I'd never done before. I remember having to do like a Dragon's Den type pitch for one of these charities, and I was absolutely petrified. But it was such a buzz to, have 5 minutes and there's a bell and you're done, and but to do it and then to actually, be successful and win some money was brilliant. Yeah. And so that was just a time of like rebuilding the ruins, I think, and remembering who I was, because I came home really broken, didn't understand what had happened, couldn't work out what was lies, what was real, because I think, truth is really important to me now. It probably always was on one level, but my first marriage was just smoke and mirrors and lies and confusion and psychological abuse is what I know it is now, but like just making me doubt myself all the time, having appointments made for me to go and see psychologists because there must be something wrong with me, and just it was a whole world where reality was denied, and it was so confusing. I was so broken, and it's why now my poor kids have been raised whether you tell the truth, whatever. So it's my thing. I'm like, just tell the truth. If it's tough, if it's uncomfortable, we'll deal with it. But we tell the truth.
So yeah, like the truth aspects that we're talking about. How does that take shape now? So you said your girls are like, oh, they just have to tell. What does that look like practically? How is that different to how other people might approach things?
Oh, I think it's different to how some people approach things, because we want things to be comfortable and we want to take the edges, like the rough edges off things, and so we'll dodge around the hard edges of truth sometimes, and we'll try and find other ways in. And here's the thing, like, I'm not for bulldozing in and being rude or obnoxious. Like that isn't who I am at all. But pretending things haven't happened isn't okay either. And pretending the world is different to how it is isn't okay. We need to call things what they are, because that's the only way we change it. And it's the only way that we feel safe, is if our reality is recognised and affirmed. And it's so important in the work that I do. I know that one of the most important things we do for the women that we work with who have been through domestic abuse, who will have experienced hundreds of all the things that I've experienced and more probably, but to have somebody say, gosh, that sounds terrible, I can hear, and just to affirm their story. Sometimes that's all they ever needed, was someone to say, I see and I hear, and I don't question your version of reality. It's not safe to live in a world where we don't know what's true. None of us can relax if there's different versions of stories, if we don't know, like when we don't know what reality is, when we don't know what truth is, we can't relax. And I think, just even thinking about politics and Trump, in this post-truth world that we live in, it doesn't feel nice. Like it feels convenient if we can then whitewash some of our own things that we've done and we'd rather people didn't know about. But then we're still not known. And then if people love us and like us, they're loving and liking us without knowing who we really are. And so, it just never works.
And something I read that you shared around people aren't always what they seem. That really sort of stuck out to me. And the other part that kind of reflects that as well is when I was chatting with Dave Pulteney, he's a vicar in the Midlands, and a really lovely guy. And he said, he was talking around his experience at Soul Survivor, and he kind of said, I think we were just too naive. And I grew up in a Christian home, and I took everyone at face value. I always thought like, oh, they're lovely, and my assumption was their worldview was the same as mine. The way they saw me was the same way I saw them. And I remember, you remember Kevin Prosh, do you remember him?
Yeah.
He came to the church I used to, I led worship and stuff as a teenager in there, and he did this, I don't know how much it cost, but the leaders at the time hired him to do a gig. And I remember, I loved his songs. I loved how, all those 90s words of being abandoned and like the freedom in worship, all that sort of stuff. And it really inspired me. But I remember him, I was with a girl a couple of years older than me that I fancied. And I remember him saying to her, oh, what are you doing afterwards? And he was in his 40s or 50s or whatever. And she would have been 18 or 19. And I just thought, oh, he's not what I thought he would be.
Yeah.
But that didn't help me very much. Because I just thought, oh, well, he's just whatever. He's just a bit nefarious or whatever, or that's going on. But there's the sense that unless you've been through crap, your understanding of truth is limited, especially when you're understanding other people.
Definitely.
And so, I mean, for me, I wanted to ask, another question I wanted to ask is, what does wisdom look like from your perspective? Because I was thinking, with your experience with work that you do, just reading your blog posts and stuff that you shared, there's real wisdom there. And I was thinking, well, how do you shape that? Because, again, I'll return to a sort of church, and it feels like it hasn't grown up since I was a teenager, and think, wow, is there truth there? Is it still naive? Is there wisdom?
Yeah.
Is there that stuff of when the two women approach Solomon and say that it's my child, well, we'll cut it in half, you have both. Where is that stuff? And so, yeah, how do you approach it at that point? Are a lot of us just still pretty naive, and we're not able to see the self-serving or narcissistic or the abusive, or just the ungodly ego that seems to reduce people into being controlled?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things, because I think there is still massive naivety around, but I think it comes from a self-protection thing, probably psychologically, in that whole we want to see the best in people, and truthfully, we're kind of cultured into seeing the best in people as church, and and I'm a big fat proponent. One of the things that we model in my staff team is assume the best.
Yeah.
Assume the best. If somebody says something awkward and clangy, assume that they meant well before you've got evidence to the contrary, but it doesn't mean you don't check. That's wisdom.
Yeah.
Wisdom is assume they meant well, but check they meant well. That came over a bit awkward. It's made me wonder if you think this. I'm assuming you don't, but wisdom, I think, it does have to come with experience, but it also has to come with humility, and it has to come with this openness to the world not always being as nice as we want it to be, because psychologically we just try and protect ourselves. It's why we victim blame. We go, oh, well, if she hadn't worn that skirt, or if she hadn't have been walking out that time of night, because if it's her fault that she got, attacked, then actually the world is still a safe place for us, because I won't wear a skirt like that. I'll make sure my kids don't, and we'll get them home before 9. And so what we're really trying to do is a psychological self-protection thing of, I want my world to be safe, so I have to construct the world in a way that makes me feel safe, even if it's not.
Yeah.
And I think we do that with leaders, because I need my world to feel safe. I need my faith to feel secure. So I cannot have a world in which Mike Pilavachi, for example, can be capable of doing those things, because that dismantles a lot of my understanding. And it makes me have to question a whole bunch of things, which frankly is really uncomfortable, and I don't want to. So there's a lot of comfort that we try and create, which then means that we choose to be naive. And so there's a real humility and there's a cost to not being naive. But equally, for those of us who perhaps have been through the hard times and been through the rubbish, there's a real importance to us making sure that we pass on what we've learned. That we raise our kids to question things, and to know that there's a darker side to life, to understand that what we see might not be what we get. And I think I could sit on my soapbox for hours about how important it is that we do this in our schools, at our youth groups, and at home. I've literally created a parenting seminar on how do we do these conversations with our kids? How do we make sure our kids don't succumb to some of the vile messaging that's around at the moment? Like, how do we help them think critically? But that's how we raise wise children, a wise next generation. But for ourselves, there's a lot of humility. I don't know everything. My judgment might be off. And there's this willingness to bear the cost of, well, the world might not be quite what I want it to be, and I'm prepared to wrestle with that discomfort.
Yeah. So the kind of, there's been a flip, I guess, in me, where I'd always think of the best in someone. I'd trust them until they lost it. And that was always how I managed.
Yeah.
But culture, I think, is now taking us to a thing of, well, what have you actually got that either is useful to me?
Yeah.
What value do you add? What can you bring to the wider group? It seems so anti the
Jesus.
stuff we read. Jesus. Yeah, it does. What are you seeing? Like, one of the stats that you said or the statements you said when we were talking on video a couple of weeks ago, on a video call, was essentially there isn't a percentage difference in domestic abuse really in the church as outside of it. And where I'm still sort of thinking, I'd love to get back into church, I'm like, wow, that's the stuff that I think must still hold people back from getting involved in different communities, and putting their time and themselves into it. So why is that? What are some of the things that you've learned from, how long have you been in this? So
I've been at Restore for 6 years now. So
what are some of the patterns, or why is that? Is it always been like that? Is it always going to be like that? What is it down to our naivety as Christians? Is it down to our lack of wisdom? How are people? Because when you were telling me some of those things, I was thinking, oh gosh, what do I apply with my wife Abby? Like, some of those controlling things?
Yeah.
One of her friends I don't really like. I go, do you have to hang out with them? It makes you a bit like prickly when you're home. And I'm thinking, gosh, is that one of those things? Even you're saying it is. So there's a propensity in me to do some of that stuff naturally without even thinking about it.
There's a propensity in all of us. Like, we just have to be honest about that and go, we all have a tendency to want to control the world around us.
Yeah.
And sometimes that leaks out into the people around us. And so, but acknowledging that and then going, maybe next time I won't handle it like that. That's good. But that's the thing. That's the thing about truth telling, is acknowledging, going, oh man, I think that was a bit controlling. Sorry. As opposed to nothing to see here. That didn't happen. You're making a big deal out of it. That's the difference between us being human and broken. And, truthfully, I think that, ever since the fall, we've had this desire to control everything and everyone around us. But actually, when we're able to catch it and go, oh, I really would love you to stop seeing that person because I don't think they're a good influence. I don't think they bring out the best in you, the things, and go, but actually, you get to choose who your friend. Like when we step back and go, I'm not going to say that anymore because that's not fair. You need to make your own mind up. That's the difference between like an innate desire or urge to do something. But when we catch ourselves and go, probably shouldn't do that again, then we're okay.
You were in Bristol for a bit.
Yep.
Tell me then, what then was happening?
What was
the next stage?
I was in and around Bristol for about 5 years, and in that space and time I met my lovely second husband, which I always feel really weird saying my second husband as if there's going to be a third, fourth and fifth. I'm not planning on it. And so we met on holiday in the spring harvest place in France at Le Pas-Octon, and kind of bonded over a pub quiz and stayed in touch. And then, long story short, got married with our very gigantic blended family of 6 kids. And I moved down here to Littlehampton. It must be 18 years ago, actually. And we just navigated the challenges of blended family and being remarried with all the complexities and baggage that we both brought in from our first marriages. And try to make things work. It's really fundamentally how that felt at the beginning, was how do we make this thing work? How do we have enough money? How do we build a house? How do we, our kids were amazing actually, and they got on amazingly well. Did not go without our challenges along the way later on. We've certainly had more than our fair share of stuff, and definitely made more than my fair share of mistakes. But yeah, that saw me move down here. And then truthfully, how the jobs and the different things I've done that have gone from that place to where I am now, is I look back and I can see God's hand all over it, as he was slowly taking me on this very unconventional training course that I didn't even realise I was doing. But yeah, that moved me down here.
In terms of, there's an exception to it from my experience of what a lot of people were like in churches. And how can things look different for the person that has been excluded? Do you see what I'm trying?
Yeah.
What does healing look like? What's the kind of good news that you talk about when you're speaking to others?
I can talk about that. Yeah, because I think the reality is that we're all we're wired for connection. Like psychologists would tell us that, but theologically that's true too. We're made in the image of a God who was 3 and 1 even before the earth began. We're designed to live in community, and so when we're excluded from community, we can't flourish, because that's not how we're designed. It's not how we're meant to be. And so one of the things that we do at Restored, which I know is part of what is restorative for so many of these women, is we create community, and it's one of our core values, is creating safe community. And for women who've been through domestic abuse, that looks like an online community that we have. So we've got something we call the Survivors Network. It's actually the largest survivors network in the country. I only discovered that recently.
Wow.
But we've got nearly 1,000 women who engage at all different levels. But we do recovery groups, and we have a peer support network, like an online forum, which is the most beautiful space where these women who've never met sometimes, but are able to share stories and find people who get it. And so much of it is inspired by a woman who was in the very first online group that I ran. So I'd been asked to run a Kintsugi Hope course, mental wellbeing course, and to think through how we needed to adapt it for survivors. And in the very first session, this woman put up her hand and she said, "Can I just stop us for a moment?" And I assumed I'd said something that was a bit triggering, and I said, "Yeah, if you need to take some time out, that's fine." And she said, "No." She said, "I need to say that I realised I finally found my people." She said, "You get what I've been through and you get my faith. I've never had this." And it was one of those moments, when all the hairs went up on the back of my neck, as I thought, this is really important. We're going to have to do this again. And we have. And so what we do is we just continually trying to find spaces and places and ways of creating community and creating friendship and people who get it. And one of those ways that we do it now is that like the only thing we ever really do in person at the moment, I want to do more, but need more money. But the thing we do at the moment is we do a retreat once a year. And again, those women just come together and they're like, this is the first place I've been where I don't feel I have to explain myself. This is the first place I've been where I haven't even had to tell my story because you already get it. And those spaces are so precious. Like that weekend is always my favourite weekend of the year. And because it's these women who you can almost see them, just their whole bodies beginning to relax into this space where, you know, you get my story. I've not, like nobody, everyone else has so many questions about why it must be my fault. I'm like, oh, I don't think, you know, we don't even have to talk about that. No. It's fine. And I think like that's modelling the kind of communities we need to create and the spaces. And like the world is complex and I know that. And we have this like little idyllic space, you know, out in the heart of the countryside that we can create. And there's no other complexities coming in. But actually it's what church needs to be like, and we need to create the spaces. And so as an organisation, we now developing a network of churches around the country who can do what we do online in their local community, who can create those spaces for those women who feel they don't belong anywhere else. Their story's too awkward, they're too inconvenient. But here's a space where they haven't got to explain themselves and they don't need to, you know, they don't need to worry about their story because their story's already understood and accepted, and that's a good space. And so like what we're learning to do and working with those churches is something that I long to see replicated, because those churches don't just create a safe little corner in the church, like a kiddies corner for survivors. Actually, those churches are committed to telling the truth. Those churches are committed to talking about power and how we recognise the power that we have in our hands and how we hold it and how we give it away and how we call out abuse and how we challenge toxic cultures. How do we do those things? And so as we work with those churches to help them be real beacons of hope in their community, then we really hope that becomes contagious and rolls over into more spaces, because it has to be possible. Like that's what Jesus did everywhere he went. Yeah. He created safe spaces where people could just be themselves. And it didn't mean they didn't get challenged to change things about them that needed to change, but they were welcome and they were loved on that journey. And I think that's what church is meant to look like. And it didn't look like pretending people weren't disasters at some point. It didn't look like, you know, you think about somebody like Zacchaeus coming down out of his tree, and like he was so welcome, but he did have to do some stuff because he had to acknowledge the mistakes. He had to acknowledge the harm he'd done. Like you've totally robbed people of their money. You need to go and give it back. And I think, you know, there's so, like the Bible is full of how this should be, and we just need to get back to it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a chap who I need to meet with him again soon, but it's just I've been all over the place. But he's I think he's one of the only Anglican monk or monastery, okay. And I meet with him. I've met with him a lot, and I need to see him again. But it's really interesting when I talk with him around what does a life of faith look like, and I don't need to sort of compartmentalize and say that's what monastic living is like, because I'm asking him, how do I live better, and how do I how do I deepen a relationship with God? What does a relationship with Jesus look like?
Yeah.
And the more he talks to me and the more I hear, the less I want it.
Yeah.
There's such a of a required vulnerability. So I ride a bike. It's not like I'm danger adverse, or risk adverse. But I'm not sure I want to be. I'm not sure I want to be kind of exposed again.
Yeah.
Because when I was vulnerable before,
it really hurt.
Yeah. So is that what that group does? How do people? Because you say there's Zacchaeus, and from my evangelical kind of upbringing, and I know my Bible, and I think there's a little bit of there's a disconnect between, there's work to be done in you, and that's some sort of, grafting. But it's not, it's
no,
you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm trying to, how have you experienced that personally? Because I think when we're really vulnerable or we're exposed to God, that's where some of those kind of glimpses can happen.
Yeah. I think there's two things that are really important there. And one is when we're dealing with people, like that doesn't mean we don't have boundaries. Doesn't mean that we have to talk about this all the time in the work that I do, is like we have to understand that, this is kind of bringing something else in now as well. But like forgiveness is one thing, that doesn't mean we go back into a relationship with somebody. It doesn't mean we have to be reconciled and act like nothing ever happened. It doesn't mean that we don't have boundaries. It might mean that we never have contact with that person again. That doesn't mean we're not forgiving, because actually safety really matters. There's plenty of examples of Jesus disappearing up off a mountain to get away from people, of people like King David running away into the wilderness to get away from an abusive king. So there are all these examples of it's okay to be safe. It's okay to be safe. It's okay to put, it's really important. Like God has boundaries with us, and we're allowed boundaries. Truthfully, he allows us to have boundaries with him, but we can have boundaries with other people so that the Bible talks about guarding our hearts. We do need to be wise when we enter a relationship. And I always talk about choose who you will be vulnerable with. Like, don't go more biblical references are spewing out of me today, but don't throw your pearls before swine. Don't do it. Don't put yourself in a situation which doesn't feel safe. So I am 100% not about making yourself vulnerable with people who aren't safe to be vulnerable with people who will take that, twist it, use it over you. Like that, if somebody gives you a glimmer that they're not safe, which might be that they're gossiping about other people, it might be the way, it's usually the way you hear them speaking about other people. You think, well, that's how they speak about that. How are they going to talk about me when I'm not in the room? Like, it's some of those things, isn't it? Like, don't be careful who you're vulnerable with. I would always say that, and approach churches with care until they allow them to prove themselves to be safe spaces. But God is safe. And this is what I was talking about at the retreat with the women I was working with, because we were talking about how do we have joy in the midst of like really big suffering? What does that look like? And how does it not just something really twee and classically Christian? And we talked about gratitude, and we talked about connection and relationships. But within that, I talked about Jesus, and we've been looking at the book of Philippians in particular. And there's like this passage that people are really familiar with. It's the bit where it talks about Jesus who made himself nothing, came down from heaven to be born in a stable, and blah 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 blah. Yeah. That feels heretic to say blah blah about that. blah blah blah. And then he ended up on a cross. But there's that bit. But the verses that come before are, I think, now my standout verses in the Bible, because it's the reason why Jesus is safe, and it's the reason why it's okay to be vulnerable with God. And it's the verse that says, in your relationships, be like Christ Jesus, who, although he was in very nature God, didn't ever use equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. And it's this beautiful nugget that goes, Jesus never played the God card. He never waved it over people. He never said, do you not know who I am? He never said, well, I'm God, so you'll do what I say. He gave people advice. He answered questions. He asked what felt like stupid questions. What would you like me to do for you? Well, I'm blind. I'd like to see. But he never just zapped people, said, I'm going to restore your sight. He just didn't do that. And yet we do behave like that. We go around going, I know what's best for you, and I know what's best for you. Actually, Jesus didn't. And because Jesus never uses equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, he's really safe to be vulnerable with. He's the safest of the safe. And so that means that no matter what our experience of humankind is and church is, we can still be safe and vulnerable and lean into who Jesus is, because he's not like the people who've hurt us. He just isn't. And that is what keeps me going, I think, in the midst of all I do.